As well as lots of other things, the war in Iran and the associated disruption to the Strait of Hormuz has reminded us that we are all still very dependent on maritime trade. Even in a world crisscrossed by trucks, trains, and cargo planes, ships still carry more than half of the world's trade by value, and something like 85% by volume, leaving the global economy precariously dependent on a number of narrow and thus vulnerable waterways. So in this video, we thought we'd take a look at the global economy's so-called choke points, and how they compare to the Strait of Hormuz. Explore which world leaders are winning and which are losing every week on our podcast, the World Leader Leaderboard. Find it over on the TLDR podcast YouTube channel or in your favorite podcast app. Now, the first thing to stress here is that while there are lots of other potential choke points, the Strait of Hormuz is particularly crucial for global trade for the simple reason that, well, there just isn't really another way around it. The Strait of Hormuz just is the only maritime route out of the oil-rich Persian Gulf into the rest of the world. There are a couple of other potential choke points that fit this bill. The Turkish Straits is the only way out of the Black Sea, for instance, and the Danish Straits are the only way out of the Baltic Sea. But neither of these are as important to international trade, and especially energy markets, as the Strait of Hormuz is. And basically every other big choke point has alternative sea routes. Now, since the Strait of Hormuz's de facto closure, a number of affected countries have found creative workarounds to keep their oil and gas exports up. Iraq, for instance, has lent more heavily on pipeline exports to Turkey. The UAE has exported more from the port of Fujairah, which sits on the other side of the Strait of Hormuz, and the Saudis have been using their east-west pipeline to transport oil across the country to the Red Sea. But this is far from a perfect solution. None of these alternative routes have the capacity to fully replace trade through the strait. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in this mess. And things could get a lot worse if the Bab el-Mandeb, the next choke point on our list, were to be shut. For context, the Bab el-Mandeb, which literally translates to the Gate of Grief, is a narrow passage connecting the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden, and therefore the Indian Ocean. Most seaborne trade between Europe and Asia passes through the Bab el-Mandeb, which is why it's actually more crucial for global trade than the Strait of Hormuz. According to analysis by The Economist, for instance, something like 16% of all seaborne trade by value passes through the Bab el-Mandeb, compared to about 6% for the Strait of Hormuz. Now, the Strait of Hormuz gets more attention because it's usually more central to international energy markets. In normal times, something like 20% of all oil and gas trade consumed by the world passes through the Strait of Hormuz, compared to more like 10% for the Bab el-Mandeb. This has changed in recent weeks, though, because, as we mentioned a moment ago, Saudi Arabia started relying more heavily on exports via the Red Sea, which mostly flow out towards Asia via the Bab el-Mandeb. Unfortunately for both the Saudis and the global economy, on Saturday the Houthis, who are widely considered an Iranian proxy outfit and who control most of southern Yemen, announced that they would be joining the war. So far this has mostly involved sending an occasional missile towards Israel, but there's been some speculation that, if the war continues, the Houthis could escalate by targeting ships passing through the Bab el-Mandeb, as they did in the aftermath of October 7th, which would effectively close the strait. Even if the Houthis, who have a degree of operational independence from Iran, decide against it, it's still within striking distance of Iran. And last week, an unnamed Iranian military official told the semi-official Tasnim news agency that Iran was considering opening a new front at Bab el-Mandeb if Trump were to attempt a ground invasion. If this were to happen, it would be pretty terrible news for trade between Europe and Asia, given that the next most direct maritime route includes an 8,000-kilometer detour around Africa. In fact, there are only 3 other choke points in the global economy that would cause a similar inconvenience to shipping. The first is the Suez Canal, which sits at the top of the Red Sea and is effectively part of the same route as the Bab el-Mandeb. Like the Bab el-Mandeb, its closure would be terrible for Europe-Asia trade and force ships to go round the Horn of Africa. The second is the Panama Canal, which is incredibly important for maritime trade between the east and west sides of America, and for trade between America's east coast and Asia. Its closure would force ships going between America's east and west coasts to go all the way around South America, and force ships going between America's east coast and Asia to go via the Atlantic rather than the Pacific, which takes about 50% longer. The third is the Strait of Gibraltar, which sits between Morocco and Spain, and is especially important for trade between the Mediterranean states and both America and the rest of Europe. This choke point doesn't really get as much attention as the others because, well, everyone sort of assumes it will always be open, but its closure would be incredibly disruptive. Not only would it force an absolutely insane detour all the way around Africa, up through the Bab el-Mandeb and then the Suez Canal, it would also prove massively disruptive to the global economy, given that, according to The Economist, something like 20% of the world's maritime trade by value passes through here, more than any of the other straits we've mentioned so far. In fact, the only strait that hosts more trade is the Strait of Malacca, a stretch of water sandwiched between the Indonesian island of Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula, with Singapore at its southern tip. The strait connects the Indian Ocean in the west with the South China Sea and Pacific Ocean in the east, and as such is vital for maritime traffic travelling between East Asia, the Middle East, Africa and Europe. China is particularly dependent on the Strait of Malacca, which accounts for something like 2/3 of all of China's maritime trade and about 3/4 of its oil imports. In 2003, Chinese Premier Hu Jintao coined the term Malacca dilemma to refer to this precarious dependence on the strait, and the associated risk that some future adversary, perhaps the US, might block the strait in the event of a conflict. But to be honest, it probably wouldn't be the end of the world, given that there are lots of alternative routes that don't require massive detours. This is true for most of the other nearby straits too, like the Taiwan Strait between Taiwan and the Chinese province of Fujian, and the Korea Strait between South Korea and Japan. While lots of trade does pass through these routes, they're relatively easily circumvented, which means that their closures probably wouldn't be as disruptive as what's currently happening in the Strait of Hormuz. Now, there are a lot of big players involved in this story, and it's no secret that the world we live in is run by big players like these. But not just in the world of politics. Big companies also have a complete monopoly over the world we live in, and avoiding them is kind of out of our control, as they seep into every part of our day-to-day life. But what if we told you that you could get some of that control back, starting with your email? I know you're thinking, my email? How much will that actually help? Well, your email is personal to you, and it's important to keep hold of what's yours. Most messaging apps make sure to let you know that your messages are end-to-end encrypted. So why do emails deserve any less? Well, thankfully, Proton Mail offers a solution to this. It's a private, secure alternative to big companies like Gmail, and will give you everything you need to be productive while also keeping those pesky ads away from your inboxes. Although it's more than just the annoying ads, it's the fact that every single person is born with privacy, but now that privacy is essentially non-existent because of our digital world. Today, children begin building their digital identity before they're even born, without them even having a choice. Email inboxes weren't created to protect children. They were designed to collect data and feed that information into AI systems that will shape the way they're categorized and targeted for life. That's where Proton Mail's Born Private campaign comes in, as they offer a complete generational reset, giving you the opportunity to reserve an email account for your child. Their account can easily be reserved today, and it can be secured and protected for up to 15 years. This will give your child a secure digital start from day one, as when they're ready, their inbox is waiting, private, clean, and fully theirs. So if you want to take back your privacy, or protect the future privacy of your family, start using Proton Mail for free using our link at proton.me/bp/TLDR, and you'll be one step closer to a fully protected online experience, free from data exploitation.